Love Lies Bleeding, the latest A24 film, follows a recent trend of movies that have high critical praise, yet I find myself scratching my head and asking the question, why? Love Lies Bleeding, despite a talented cast, is a mess. And I know a lot of you are leaving the theater wondering to yourself, what was that ending? And don't worry, I'm going to be talking about that in this review later and why I thought Love Lies Bleeding is a mess. But before we get into that, let's talk about what Love Lies Bleeding is. Love Lies Bleeding is a romantic thriller directed by Saint Maud director Rose Glass. Distributed by A24, Love Lies Bleeding stars Kristen Stewart as Lou, daughter of a crime boss named Lou Sr., played by Ed Harris. One day, a rising bodybuilder by the name of Jackie walks into the gym and becomes enamored by Lou, beginning their relationship in this sexy crime thriller featuring lots of blood, guts, and oh my god, some big abs. Dave Franco and Jena Malone co star in Love Lies Bleeding, along with Katy O'Brian, who stars as the bodybuilder Jackie. So let's talk about what went wrong with Love Lies Bleeding here. And my first instinct is to talk about the script of this movie as my main source of my frustration while watching Love Lies Bleeding, because I do want to say there are aspects of this movie that I think are good. I think the cinematography of this movie, and I'll talk about that a little later on, but I think overall this movie is pretty well shot and it has some really beautiful lighting in moments, but it feels disconnected to the rest of the film. I believe Ed Harris gives a really strong performance as the crime boss in this movie. And this lesbian aspect of this movie, of this relationship in this backdrop of a noir movie in the desert, I thought it was really building to something. So the first 35 to 45 minutes of this movie, where everyone is getting into place as we're learning who these characters are, I was pretty into this movie. But the script just doesn't justify keeping my interest. The script is a mess, as we just don't have enough time separating and developing this romance between Lou and Jackie, played by Katy O'Brian and Kristen Stewart. Kristen Stewart, who is an actress I usually defend and I think is generally underrated, I just wasn't quite sure what she was doing in this role. And I found it very disconnecting that she is supposed to be this character of a crime family and that she's been around in this world. And yet, Stewart herself in her performance played it a little bit innocent for too much of the film, where I was just like, how can these two ideas exist? How can someone be in this world and seem to have done really bad things in this world and yet be so adverse to the imagery of this world? Katy O'Brian, who is probably the performance most people are talking about in Love Lies Bleeding, just because her body is a special effect in this movie. She's jacked. She is absolutely ripped in Love Lies Bleeding. And it's a pretty incredible, I don't know if it's quite a transformation for her, because I don't know what she typically looks like outside of this film. But what is shown on screen is something pretty wholly impressive, where you're kind of enamored by her. And when it's this relationship developing between her and Stuart, you do feel sparks of chemistry, and you do see why someone would like Lou would be just taken by the sheer physicality that this character played by Katy O'Brian works. The flip side of it is I just don't think Katy O'Brian was able to hit some of the dramatic beats of this movie, as we follow this bodybuilder and she starts experimenting with steroids, and we literally watch her body kind of hulk out. Like, I mean, quite literally, that is the best description for what she does in this movie. You see the effect steroids has on her and how much more violent it makes her, and you literally see her body transforming. This literal effect of watching her body grow and morph in front of us, it comes into this idea of if the character is experiencing something surreal, or if it is a delusion of grandeur that they are explaining. And that's something that I want to talk about a little bit later in this review. And that's kind of my main source of frustration while watching Love Lies Bleeding. But in this script, I just believe everything becomes quite clear right away when it is taking itself on the noir mystery aspect of other screenplays like it. And yet I don't feel anything different. And every moment I felt like I knew exactly where this story was going to go. I have to admit, it made for an unpleasant experience watching this, where the beginning of the film feels so subversive with putting these types of characters in this noir world. Like, that's not typically characters that you would expect to see in this world. And then, right when you kind of get over it, everything just feels so straightforward. The characterizations of everyone is straightforward. And it feels like the movie is trying to be subversive. And it is at the beginning. But by the conclusion, everything falls into place and it becomes every noir film ever. The issue then becomes that Ed Harris's character, Lou Sr., is in the movie we all kind of think this movie is, which is just a straightforward noir film. Yet Kristen Stewart and Katy O'Brian are in just a completely different movie. There is an event in the second act of this movie that really changes what this movie is about and really gets into the violence of this world. And it really just sidelines Katy O'Brien's, and it takes her out of the main story with Harris and with Stewart. So she's kind of doing her own thing, and her own thing is interesting, yet it feels so completely unattached to the actual rest of this movie. And everything that this character, played by Katy O'Brien, discovers while in Vegas, you already understood. There's no real nuance to anything new with this characterization. And that was just such a waste of screen time going into it and not feeling like I learned anything new about this character. I wanted to talk about some of the technical issues I had with Love Lies Bleeding, and I think it is adding to the tonal mess of this movie. And I also think it is going to be really informative when I talk about the spoilers that I teased to earlier, and really just kind of making my thoughts clear on what frustrated me about it. But there are aspects that I want to praise in its technical abilities. I think it has a really good soundtrack and score throughout that adds a visceral feeling to the movie. The reality of Love Lies Bleeding is there are certain scenes in this movie that look beautiful, and they're going to be shared, and you're going to get a certain aesthetic that comes out of this film, but it feels like aesthetic without real purpose in this movie for a lot of times. And I just found it so frustrating to engage with it. Again, not to discredit the lighting techniques put into it, I just thought it was lighting for lighting's sake, not for anything that really added anything to this feeling and world, which I think is a good way to transition into my spoiler thoughts of Love Lies Bleeding. So just be aware right now, I am in full spoiler territory, which is going to begin in 3, 2, 1. Let's talk about this ending of Love Lies Bleeding, where I think the film is battling surrealism and delusions of grandeur. And the scene that I'm specifically referring to is when the character played by Katy O'Brian appears on screen to save Kristen Stewart from her father, and she appears quite literally as a 50-foot woman. And she saves the day. And I think there are some people who are going to read this scene as a complete delusion of grandeur. This is the moment where Kristen Stewart sees her lover for who she is and the saving person. It becomes kind of a superhero movie, right? That is, I think, one approach. And I also think it's blending that surrealism element of this movie. What is delusion? What is surrealism? What is real? What is not? I think is what this movie ambiguity is trying to lead up to in its final few moments. And I know some people are going to be really enamored by this scene. I found this scene to be quite jarring, and I know that is the intended effect of this moment. However, it was startlingly jarring in a way that didn't feel earned. And what I mean by that is this movie, I think, believes itself to be surrealist and for us to be seeing these kind of delusions of these characters. Yet I didn't really find it anywhere else in the movie. I think there was one moment with Katy O'Brien's character when she is in Vegas and she kind of has this out of body experience of her thinking about the death that she has caused and having basically this panic attack as she's experiencing all these emotions from finally being in this bodybuilding contest she has worked so hard to be at. And that is a clear effect of the steroids. And so, yes, while you could call this scene a little bit surrealist and has elements of delusion, as she is quite literally experiencing delusion in this moment, it feels like an after fact of the steroids that she's taking. And none of the rest of the film really engages with this type of imagery that we see until the final 5 minutes. So it just feels so jarring when it happens on screen. And you're like, none of the film led me to this moment, nor did any of the other choices made throughout the plotting of this movie lead me to believe that it would break the fourth wall, if you will, that much as it finally did in its ending. And some people are really going to like it. Some people are going to respond to that as a really bold and ambitious choice. I will have to give the film that is a very bold and ambitious choice to have that type of imagery in your film. But I found it to be just quite non-provocative. I thought it was just a pretty clear metaphor. The talent of Rose Glass is very clear within Love's Lies Bleeding. I believe she does have quite a promising career, and I do believe she is capable of making a movie that is exciting and visceral because she hits it at moments in this film. And Love Lies Bleeding is far too cliched for me to get invested in this story and be taken by the style. And that's my main criticism of this film. It was an ambitious effort, but I didn't believe it led to much. And ultimately, that's how I'd sum up the movie. Love Lies Bleeding on a scale of 5 stars, I'm giving it 2 out of 5 stars.